Hey everybody, Arnaldo here, broadcasting from Fidelio's Frequency. Welcome to my channel, and welcome to another episode of The Sun Shines Out of Our Behinds. Today is a special day, February 20th, 2024, marks the 40th anniversary from the release of The Smiths' debut album. So today, we'll take a deep dive into The Smiths' self-titled debut album right after our intro. The Smiths' self-titled debut album was released on February 20th, 1984, and it was a long journey to get to the release of this album. As a matter of fact, the first album by the Smiths is considered probably the most difficult album of their career. In the first part of 1983, the Smiths were playing live quite a bit, and they were capturing the attention of press and gathering more and more fans, up until the point where they were invited by John Peel to perform on his radio show on the BBC. And in May of 1983, they entered the BBC studios and recorded sessions for two shows, actually. Not only the John Peel show, but also the David Jensen show. And they were quite popular and creating even more buzz for the Smiths. It came time to enter the studio to put down to tape the 14 songs that up until then Johnny Marr and Morrissey had written and had been performing for quite a bit. Jeff Travis, label head of Rough Trade, assigned Troy Tate to produce the sessions. He had recently been hired by Rough Trade, and he's a former member of the Teardrop Explodes and guitarist of the Teardrop Explodes, and booked sessions in a sweltering hot studio in London for the Smiths to record their first album. It didn't go so well. There were a lot of difficulties in recording, and the outcome from those sessions, which was supposed to be the final album, was not to the liking of Morrissey, Marr, and the rest of the band, but even more so to the liking of Jeff Travis, who drafted in John Porter, who had engineered and produced a few of the tracks that were featured on the David Jensen show at the BBC, in order to fix or remix or mix the album or the tapes from those sessions. John Porter, former member of Roxy Music and accomplished musician, listened to the tapes and thought that they were beyond fixing. He offered to produce a new set of sessions to record the album, and at that point, Jeff Travis already had exhausted the majority of the budget allocated for recording the album and decided to give it a go, speaking with the band, and to kind of scrounge up some additional money so that the group could book some new sessions with John Porter. And it was recorded over 4 studios because that was the availability of at the time and what fell within the budget. So between 2 studios in London, I believe Eden and Matrix, and 2 studios in Manchester, Strawberry and Pluto, the Smiths started recording again in September through October of 1983, and they were pretty much pressured by the deadline of their upcoming single, which was scheduled to be released in October of 1983, and that is This Charming Man. I also did a video on This Charming Man and getting more into the details of that, so if you want to check that out on my channel, feel free to do so. Like I said, the band entered these new sessions, and this time John Porter had a more active role than Troy Tate. Troy Tate was only limited to capturing the sound of the Smiths. John Porter was a real producer, and he suggested new ideas, new arrangements, actually went ahead and tried to rearrange some of the tracks that the Smiths already were playing for quite a bit of time, and were pretty adamant in continuing to play them also on the debut album. But they were open and receptive to ideas, especially Johnny Marr, who saw the opportunity because John Porter brought in a ton of other guitars into the studio while they were recording to utilize other guitars to make additional layers of overdubs with guitars. But John Porter went further in suggesting a little bit more radical arrangements, rearrangements of some of the songs, changing drum patterns, bass lines, some of the guitar melodies, and the group, I want to say, kind of felt a little bit intimidated by this, but also because John Porter was an accomplished musician and producer, so they went along with it. Even though sometimes they say that maybe some of the songs, namely This Charming Man, that was released later as a single, and Reel Around the Fountain and What Difference Does It Make, are quite different from the way we hear them from the BBC sessions. So they went along with it, completed the album. Jeff Travis was much happier with these sessions, and that was it for now. The Smiths were not 100% certain about the outcome of those sessions, but they really needed to get this album out. The Smiths' debut album is like a coming of age album, both for Morrissey and for Marr. For Marr, mostly because musically, working with John Porter, it kind of opened up his mind, and he learned very important skills that he would utilize to produce further or subsequent albums of the Smiths. And for Morrissey, it was kind of emptying out his diary up until then onto this album. And then we'll talk a little bit about the lyrical shift from the batch of songs on the first album, and then onwards through the subsequent albums, subsequent singles, and his solo output as well. Morrissey basically said that the lyrics were composed during a period between 1977 and 1983. During that time, Morrissey would jot down quotes, interesting quotes, shove them in his books, pull them out as inspiration for other lyrics. And Morrissey has said that the songs on the first album are probably his most personal, very autobiographical. They deal with past regrets, rebuked love, human suffering, sexual insecurity, and they show a different type of Morrissey, not only the heart of Morrissey, but also the hurt of Morrissey, and different from what he started writing about afterwards in his career, where he started tackling third-person portraits, always inventing these characters, political protests, and all these vaudevillian kind of sketches and scenarios that are quite different from what the lyrical output was on the debut album. As for Marr, like I said, it introduced him to the world of producing, and as a matter of fact, all of the subsequent albums after the Smiths' debut were self-produced. Little help here and there from Stephen Street, who originally started as an engineer, but then actually eventually ended up as getting a producer credit. But mostly the remaining albums by the Smiths have producer credits by Morrissey and Marr. Now, what else can we talk about? How the band really felt about the album. When it was released, of course, Morrissey was very proud that it was finally out, but had some reservations afterwards, along with Johnny Marr. They both felt that the songs really didn't capture the exuberance of the live performance of these songs whenever they performed them live. And they felt like they were a little, maybe too polished, a little softened. And they could have done a better job at it. But we're talking about a debut album that is ranked amongst one of the best debut albums of the 80s. The historical significance and the influence that this album had in the scene at the time, this album and the Smiths kind of brought back guitar bands. We were just getting into the synth pop of the early mid 80s, and this was indie rock. This kind of established indie rock. And along with all their other output, the Smiths, especially this album, have a very important role within the music of the 80s. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about the album cover. The image, as you probably could see in the back, came from a still shot from the movie, of a scene from the movie Flesh by Andy Warhol from 1968, and it features Joe Dallesandro, often featured in Andy Warhol movies, as in the male prostitute scene. And when the initial sketch of the artwork was presented, one of the band members, I believe Mike Joyce, said, "Wow, that's gonna, like, I don't know how I'm gonna explain that to my parents from a Christian upbringing." He didn't know that the image you see was going to be cropped by Morrissey to only show the male torso in the end. When the album came out, Morrissey was not very happy with how actually the proofs then translated into the actual album cover. As you could see here, you could barely make out the name of the band. A little bit better, actually, on maybe the US release, which I don't have, but on the Dutch or Holland release, you do make out the band's name a little bit better. And if you compare them side by side, you could see it has a little bit more contrast and slightly darker gray color. But still, Morrissey was very proud of like all of his album covers and 12-inch singles. The US version, to the disapproval of Morrissey and Marr, included also the single at the beginning of side 2 of This Charming Man, which is not featured on the original UK album. It is featured on all the subsequent CD reissues. And at the time, I was very lucky because my introduction to the Smiths, as I've mentioned before, was This Charming Man. And when my local store came across, actually had in stock the Dutch version from Holland, it came with an additional single, limited edition single, one-sided single of This Charming Man. So I couldn't help to pick up the Dutch version, which had the one-sided single. As you can see here, do not use this side because it is blank. Final thoughts. When this album came out, I was over the moon, bought it almost immediately, and I was so happy that the Smiths finally had a full-length album. In hindsight, if you compare this to the other albums in their discography, it doesn't rank for me at the highest position, at the highest. I don't like ranking, but I have to be honest. The production on this album could have been better, but we're talking about 10 fantastic songs included from the Smiths catalog included on this album. So if we're splitting hairs, it's only because there are better versions of some of these songs on another album, which came out later in 1984, after Morrissey insisted that he had second thoughts about how they were produced on the debut album, Hatful of Hollow, which is a compilation that has 5 songs from the debut album, namely the BBC sessions, the ones from John Peel, The John Peel Show, and The David Jensen Show, Reel Around the Fountain, You've Got Everything Now, Still Ill, Hand in Glove, and What Difference Does It Make from the BBC sessions are included on Hatful of Hollow. Well, I'll make another video on this album later, and in addition to B-sides and some non-album singles. So some diehard Smiths fans say this is the debut that the debut album that the Smiths should have put out. But we're splitting hairs here. This is a fantastic album, fantastic guitar album. It kickstarted a whole new, let's call it, genre of music, the indie scene. The Smiths' debut album turns 40 today, so go stream it, spin it if you have a physical copy, and enjoy it. That's all for today. That's all for this episode of The Sun Shines Out of Our Behinds. Please tune in to the other videos on my channel, and I'll see you on the next episode of The Sun Shines Out of Our Behinds. Thank you for watching. Bye.